So today we're working on a '79 Z28 Camaro. The owner brought it in because he hadn't driven it in a few years, and when he went to drive it, it wouldn't start. Trailered it in. First thing we checked is to make sure we have spark. Shot some carburetor cleaner down the carburetor, hit the key, and it lights right off. We managed to pull it in the shop by filling the carburetor bowl with carburetor cleaner through the vent, and that got us thinking about what might be the problem here. So we made sure there was gas in the tank because the gas gauge isn't working right. We checked for fuel pressure. We had 5.5 pounds of the carburetor, so it seemed that fuel was not actually getting into the carburetor, which is what prompted us to take the carburetor off the car, take it apart, and see what was going on. The car has been taken care of pretty well most of its life. The owner had the engine rebuilt about 25 years ago. All we really know is it's a basically stock 350. We don't know that it's had much done to it other than a rebuild. The carburetor is a replacement Q-jet that came from a parts store. Going off the part number you give to the parts store when you order a kit, it came off of something mid-80s. But Q-jets are all pretty similar. They went on everything from 305s all the way up to 454s at GM, and they're all basically the same except for some jets and metering rods. First thing we noticed when we had the carburetor off the car is the choke was set wrong. It was basically locked open. We pulled the top off. There was some dirt in it. The float showed signs of having some rust on it. Maybe there was dirt in the fuel tank. The fuel filter was the wrong one. It was smashed up into the fuel filter housing on the carburetor, so dirt and stuff was getting past it. So we just went ahead and took it apart, cleaned all the passages, and put it back together. The biggest thing with Quadrajet, and any carburetor really, is that they've probably been rebuilt several times, but especially Quadrajet because it's probably been more than a decade since the last one was actually made. And people tend to over-tighten the screws on the top cover and the throttle body. And since the bolts on the front of a Q-jet go all the way through the carburetor down to the manifold, people have a tendency to over-tighten those too. And what happens is you warp all the castings. So it's important to take a straight edge, especially across the top, and make sure that everything's straight, because there's passages that have to seal properly against the gasket and the main body of the carburetor for fuel and air to flow properly. If they don't seal, you can have a whole bunch of problems. The secondaries may not open properly. The fuel passages in the primary venturis won't be sealed, and you won't get enough fuel, or the fuel won't be properly atomized, so you won't have a good burn. No matter what, all those passages in any carburetor have to be sealed properly so that everything flows properly, because basically a carburetor is a controlled leak. If you're introducing new leaks into the system, it's not going to work right. The top plate of the carburetor was severely warped on this from both things, being over-tightened at the bolts and the screws. We also noticed that some of the screws in the top plate had extra lock washers and some of them were missing lock washers. Clearly, the last person to have rebuilt this, whether it was the guy who built it for the parts store or maybe a mechanic in the past, really didn't have a clue what they were doing as far as tightening things down on this. So we went through the procedure to carefully straighten this, which takes some time and some effort and some patience, because you don't want to crack the housing, because then finding replacement parts means you're going to be buying another carburetor. The procedure's relatively simple. Take some wooden blocks, plastic-faced hammer, a dead blow or something similar, and you want to work it kind of like you're working a dent out of a panel. You just got to carefully hammer the right direction to get the warp out, and once you get it as close as you can get it with a hammer, you take a file and work it flat against the piece, similar to body working a body panel. You go in a crosshatch pattern back and forth until you have it smooth and flat, and just want to keep checking your work with a straight edge, and once you have it to within the tolerance what the gasket can take up, you're ready to put it back together. What the ultimate problem with this carburetor was not getting fuel has to do with the needle valve. What the needle valve does is it controls how much fuel is in the float bowl based on the float's position. But this carburetor was missing the tiny spring clip that holds the needle valve to the float. And that's important because the needle valve needs to be physically moved up off of the seat if the float drops. If that doesn't happen, you're depending on the fuel pressure to push the needle valve open, which sometimes will work, but if the thing's been sitting around a while, like this has, the varnish from the dried fuel will make that needle valve sticky, and the fuel pressure is not strong enough to pop that needle valve off of its seat and let fuel into the carburetor. Once we had the carburetor all back together, we stuck it on the car and got the thing to run, let it warm up, adjusted the idle mixture, checked the timing, checked to see how much vacuum the car was making, and I took it for a drive. The thing runs much better. The next day I went to set the choke and discovered why the last person had the choke slammed open. The choke stove down in the intake manifold is not generating enough heat to change the shape of the coil in the choke housing. There's a few reasons this could be. The choke stove could be burned off because it's in the exhaust crossover. The exhaust crossover could be clogged with carbon and soot from 30 years of this thing being driven. So there's two ways we could go about fixing this. We could take it all apart, clean it up, put a new stove in, if a stove is even available for it, or we can do an electric conversion, and that's probably the simplest and most effective way to go anyway. So ultimately, what anybody should take away from this is that it's always important to pay attention to what you're doing, because it was the smallest piece that was keeping this car from running.